So, is addiction nature or nurture? Welcome back, and if this is your first time here and you want to learn about anxiety, all things mental health, how to deal with being a highly sensitive person and more, then please make sure you've subscribed and you turn the notifications on so you know each and every time that I post a video. So last week we had a really good discussion around whether alcohol is bad for your mental health. I had some good contact with people around the issue. Some happy, some not so happy. You know, this year I really want to focus on some more of the difficult conversations and really start to explore them in a deeper way. So for a long time I believed that it was solely genetic, right? So I believed it was completely down to nature. I used to say actually that I had such a good childhood, right? I had such an idyllic and perfect childhood. Then how could addiction possibly be anything to do with nurture when my life was so good when I was a child? Throughout my healing journey and throughout my healing process, what I've learned is that I created those narratives to protect myself from a lot of ultimate truths. You know, when I first started to really honestly admit that the only thing I remember about my dad is the bad stuff, what you realize is that in admitting that, you take away any idea and any narrative that you've told yourself about having a loving and nurturing dad in my life. And that painful truth is difficult to bear, and so it becomes obvious how and why I might have told myself a certain narrative to protect myself from that truth. And secondly, what I've learned about trauma is that lots of us think that trauma means we needed to have experienced a traumatic event, and that's not the case. Trauma is an internal wound. I've talked lots about this in other videos, but it's about what happens inside of us as a result of the things that happen to us. And so you can experience trauma simply from thinking that your parent doesn't love you in the way that you would like them to do so. When you recognize that, you start to recognize that most of us have experienced some kind of trauma to some varying degree. So when we say that there's loads of people with addiction that have never experienced trauma, when you go deep into the conversation, I think what you normally find is that that's not the case. Another reason I used to say is because I was raised with my two brothers. We were all raised the same, and so how could it be anything to do with nurture? Again, exploring this and looking at the difficult grey area in the middle, you start to realize that it's impossible to raise a group of children the same way. We all come with different personalities, we come with different characteristics, some of which parents find much easier to parent, some of which parents can find triggering. And so when we interact with different people, we interact with them differently. That's just the truth. We try our best to raise our children equally, but we don't treat them all the same. And then when it becomes to any kind of dysfunction within the family, that gets polarized too and becomes even worse. In recent terms, what we now understand more about the brain and what science is telling us more and more is that the brain is developing at its fastest rate in those initial 7 to 9 years. And so when we understand that it develops based on the environment around us, we start to recognize that so many of our responses as adults were learned and programmed when we were children. We do start to recognize now that the brain is developing for most of our life, and so these things can be overridden, but it becomes much more difficult because the predominant part of the growth of the brain is done in those initial years. What you will start to recognize is that lots of people that are in recovery from addiction themselves particularly in those early year 2 or 3 years, and this is not everyone, I'm generally speaking, will buy into the genetic idea that it's solely a genetic thing, that they were born as an addict or an alcoholic or whatever it is. And I have a theory on this. This theory is to not devalue your experience. This theory is not to make you wrong. It's a theory that I have. If it makes you angry, try not to get angry about it, because I might have a new theory next week and completely change my mind, right? So it's not worth getting angry over, but I am going to explore the theory that I have, and it's a theory that's born out of self-reflection and my own experience. I found the genetic idea that I was born an alcoholic with a deep-rooted disease easy to accept because I had become such a shame-based person. So I grew up living with the idea that there was something wrong with me, that I was defective. Whenever I did something good, I believed that I was a fraud. And so when I was sold the idea that I was born an alcoholic or an addict, it was very easy for me to accept because it made me right. It made me, so there is something wrong with me. Yeah, I am defective, right? And so I found it very easy to buy into that. It also meant that I didn't have to do any work looking at my childhood because it was all irrelevant, right? I was born like this. So it was very easy for me to take on that idea. So in answer to the question, is it nature or nurture? My answer is that it's both. That might not be what people want to hear, but I do think that the truth always lies somewhere in the grey area in between, and this is something that I'm focusing on a lot again, like I say, this year. I do not believe, by the way, though, that there is a gene that we are born with that is an addictive gene. Personally, I'm yet to have that proved to me or believe that. Again, I'm very open to changing my mind, and I wouldn't argue this in a court of law. I'm just giving you my opinion. I think it's something that develops over time. I think there are genetic factors in which could make us more susceptible to becoming addicted or more vulnerable to struggling with addiction. Sensitivity is one of those things. I do think that if we are born sensitive with a heightened sense of emotion, then we're more likely to struggle with our emotions and seek escape in an obsessive way. So there are genetic factors such as that one, but again, environment plays a lot in our sensitivity and can heighten our sensitivity, I believe, in those initial years as well. Obviously, we are all born with a certain set of characteristics, but I think predominantly we are a product of our environment. I think addiction is much more to do with our environment than we'd like to believe. I think when we accept that and when we start to work along that path, it creates a lot of difficult discussions. It creates a lot of different feelings and thoughts, particularly around our childhood and things that we have to tackle. So we would much rather it was genetic. But that's where I'm at with my opinion. Look, I'd love to hear from you. I'd love to hear your opinion on the nature or nurture. I've had quite a few across social media. Again, I asked the question on my social media this morning, and most people have said both so far, both and leaning towards it being environmental. I'd love to hear the opposite opinion. I'd love to have my opinion changed. So let's hear from you and keep the conversation going. As ever, if you've enjoyed this video, if you found it useful or good to listen to, then I'd love if you liked it, and I'll see you again next week.